Okay, so here is my 2016 Focus RS. I believe it has a C's turbo. Go ahead and crank it over. Alright, let's give it some revs and see if we can engage the turbo. Whoa, yeah. One more. Alright, cut. Actually, it turned out to be just a bad recirculation valve. One of the techs forgot to install my uprated Mountoon recirculation valve, so the stock one bit the dust coming off the banks at Daytona. And honestly, I didn't catch it until I had a master tech take apart the turbo to inspect it to find out what went wrong. He ended up figuring out that the recirculation valve was leaking. Only then I realized that my uprated recirculation valve was never installed. And things like that are the reason that I do all the work on my cars now. This video will document the replacement of the turbo. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is loosen up this cowling here. I've popped these covers off. There's a screw on either end and 4 push clips on the top. Okay, now for the bottom cowling, you got this 10 millimeter bolt here and one just like it on the other side. Okay, so now that those bolts are out of the bottom cowling, you can just take that right out. Okay, so the next step is going to be to remove this intake. So all that's involved in that is taking off these hose clamps here. Don't forget this bolt here and a couple more hose clamps there, and pop this line off and we can remove all this, get it out of the way. For the other piece of the intake, this requires a 10 millimeter deep socket. This should be finger tight, which it is. And there's a hose clamp down in there that takes a 7 millimeter socket. PCV return line that's on the back of this piece, just pinch it where the texture is and it pulls right off. This was not easy to remove. I removed this grommet from this bolt to get the intake off of it and used a back and forth motion like this to work it off, and finally was able to get it out of there. We're under the car and we need to remove this under tray. We're back under the car now, and the first thing we're going to do is remove a cross member that's blocking our access to the area where the drive shaft bolts to the PTU. That's towards the rear, right there. Okay, we've started to take off this cross member. Brian, why don't you pull down that under tray a little bit so we can see down in there. All right, so there's 1, 2 bolts there. 13 millimeter? Yeah, 13 millimeter bolts. In the center here, there's that one and that one, 13 millimeter nuts. And then on the other side, the same thing, 2 13 millimeter bolts. One of them you got to loosen the under tray to get to.
These are 15 millimeter nuts.
All right, yeah, and so now we have 2 of these 15 millimeter nuts. We'll go ahead and get these off. And hopefully this comes out after this. Come on. There we go. Cross member is out. We're going to have to remove this brace bar. It has an 18 millimeter nut and a 15 millimeter bolt on each side, so we'll go ahead and get that removed. Okay, that cross brace is off, and the next thing we're going to do is remove this hot side charge pipe. So got the charge pipe out, and Brian is putting a couple nuts and a hose clamp in a bag with a label. Let's go ahead and put those with the rest of the parts and show them what we got going over here. Alright, so we're putting all our parts over here, and for all the different parts we are labeling, putting all the nuts and bolts in a bag. You see this one is the cross brace that we took off just before the charge pipe, so we have all of the nuts and bolts from that here with the cross brace. Same thing for the intake cross member. I would highly suggest doing that because this could take days and you're not going to remember where all this stuff goes in a couple of days if you end up having to not getting it done in the weekend and having to come back the next weekend and doing it. So that's the program. So the first step to get this axle out of here will be to take the hub nut off. So I have a 32 millimeter socket here. I'm gonna give that a try. All right, let's give it a try. Got the brake on? All right, let's give it a try. Hold the steering wheel. Yeah, wow, it came right off. Amazing. All right, so this is the back side of the hub on the passenger side. The next step is going to be to disconnect this lower control arm from the hub. So the nut is out. Now we need to get this control arm disconnected. All right, so use the pry bar into this hole in the control arm and not pry against anything, but just use it as a leverage point. And let me know if that comes out. Is it moving?
Yeah, it's coming out.
That's moving. There, it's released. All right, that's it, it's out. We have this hub remover that we rented from AutoZone, $25 deposit, and get that back. So let's unbox it. Awesome. Let's put that sucker on. The brake. There you go. That's coming right out. Well, that's the end of the tool. All right, I think we figured this out. It needs to go this direction to the right, not the left. We should be able to get that axle out of there. Get it out? It's out. All right. We're back under the car. There is the axle removed from the hub. We'll follow this back up to just below the turbo assembly. And we have an axle bearing here. As you may be able to see right here is a nut. 13 millimeter, I believe, and then one on top. So we take that bearing brace off and we should be able to get the axle out. Okay, we have the bearing brace off there. Now we're trying to get the axle out of the PTU. We've tried a couple things. We think we have something that might work. So why don't we go ahead and give that a try. Right in there against the bearing brace and that piece of the axle. Trying to get some wedge in there. Moving. Yeah. Okay, we have the oil pan down to catch the oil because we had some success moving the axle. Brian was able to get it to move. See, the bearing has moved slightly off of the bearing support. And why don't you demonstrate how you were able to do that? You got a wedge in there, and did you hammer it, or did you do that?
Hammer.
Oh, so to get it to move originally, you hammered it.
Yes.
Okay, that looks like it's moving. Why don't you try to get it out of there? I got the oil pan here to catch the mess. Oh, it's really dripping now. Yeah, guide the other end, maybe.
Move that.
Oh,
Yeah, hold that out of my way, please.
Looks like you got it. Oh, wow. All right, so what has not been on camera is the past, I don't know, 30, 45 minutes of messing with this.
Grab this. Don't let it bend too.
Okay, with that axle out, we have a pretty good look at the turbo assembly. I mean, this is a pretty close view, but from a farther point of view, it looks like if we remove the rest of this bearing mount, go ahead and get this little piece of charge pipe out of the way, we may have a big enough opening here to get that turbo assembly out. It didn't take long to determine that we are in fact going to have to take out the PTU to access the bolts we need to on the turbo assembly. We're looking at the outlet of the turbo assembly here, but there's much more to it this direction underneath or above the PTU unit here. And so this PTU needs to come out. Then of course we're going to have to disconnect the drive shaft. And we removed the cross member earlier to gain access to it. So let's take a look at that, since that'll probably be the first thing we do. So there's the drive shaft. We're going to need to disconnect it there and support it somehow. So we're going to get started with that job. Okay, so this is a message from the future. I had somewhat of a hard time aligning the drive shaft to the PTU when reassembling this, so I would suggest putting an alignment mark across the PTU and drive shaft before disassembling it. So we've successfully removed some of the bolts. They're pretty hard to get out. Our 1,500 foot-pound impact wrench wasn't up to the task, so what we did was we've had somebody hold on to the drive shaft while the other person gets them loose, and then we were able to finish them out with the impact wrench. All right, all of the bolts are off of the drive shaft. We have the rags in there to support it. It's not, doesn't seem to be dripping down or drooping down, but I don't know if you can see it with my hand in there, but you see it is disconnected and can easily separate from the PTU side. So if it decides to try to lean down, we got the rags there to support it. And now time to go to the other side and get the rest of the PTU disconnected. Master connector smith Brian figured this plug out, this connector, this white piece, pull it out, and then it just comes out, right?
Straight down.
All right, I'm at a weird angle. You pull it out. There you go. All right, let's let them look up in here. So we're just going to take the two bolts, are they? Yeah, two bolts that are holding this PTU brace onto the engine. So we have one here and one up top, and we'll just leave the rest of the PTU the rest of the brace connected to the PTU. So we're just going to take these two bolts off and move on. All right, so we got one coolant line off. We weren't sure which side was going to come loose, so undid both of these clips, but you probably only need to do this one. So we're going to try to get this off, just undoing this one squeeze clip, and a decent amount of coolant came out when we undid this one, so we're hoping that was about it, but we got our bucket down here just in case. So go ahead and give that a try. Squeeze it and I'll try to pull it off. All right, here it comes. Look out. Oh. All right, not much, so that's that for the lines. The only thing we have left now are the bolts that are holding the PTU onto the transmission. Well, we thought we were down to the last 5 bolts, and these 3 on the bottom and another one right up there is easy to get to. There's another one straight up to the top, but we can't get to it, and it feels like there's this heat shield up here that's we're gonna have to remove to get to the last bolt. You can feel up here, it feels like there's 2 bolts holding on this heat shield, so we're going to try to get this heat shield off and access that top bolt. So here's the PTU heat shield. This is above the PTU. That is the drive shaft going towards the back of the car. You got 3 bolts, 8 millimeters were they?
Yeah.
8 millimeter bolts, here, here, and here. Unfortunately, I thought there was only 2 bolts from feeling around it there, so I took these 2 out and then discovered this one, which made it impossible to get out because as you're trying to loosen it out with your hands, you were putting tension on the plate, which was putting tension against the bolt and making it impossible to come out. So this bolt should be taken out first. That way you don't have that problem. And then these 2 are fairly easy, but it's all done by feel because of course you can't see it because this is on top of the PTU. And so now we're going to try to get at the 2 top bolts that are bolting the PTU to the transmission. So the 2 topmost bolts on the PTU are out. The very topmost one we got out with an extension going above the PTU, using this length of extension to get at the bolt. And then the other top bolt, which is lower than that one, we use this low profile ratchet with a 13 millimeter socket to get at it from the side. So we believe the worst of the job is done. There are 3 more bolts on the PTU left to take off, and I believe we're going to put a jack under the PTU to support it and take those last 3 bolts out and see if we can pull it. We have the entire PTU disconnected and we're trying to move it out. Go ahead and shake it, Brian, like you were trying to remove it. Yeah, and it just, there's a shaft that goes from the PTU into the transmission and we got to slide it out, but we can't slide it out far enough because that PTU brace is hitting that line for the turbo there. So before we can take this PTU out, that line's going to have to come out anyway. So we're going to take this line out and get it out of the way so we can slide the PTU out. And it's out, the infamous PTU. And there was one more surprise before we could get it out. Vacuum line connected to the top. Right as we thought we were home free, had to reach up around there and pull a vacuum line off. Luckily, there's nothing connecting it. It's just a rubber hose connecting to this and it pulls right off. It would have been easier if we would have taken the PTU brace completely off, because we think we probably could have gotten it off without disconnecting the turbo oil return line. But it's up to you. I think the way that this is, the angle that you have when this is up on the car, I think it's, and you got to take the turbo oil return line off anyway. So if I had to do it over again, the only thing I'd do different is take off the oil return line on the turbo before starting any of this. Other than that, would have done it just basically about the same. So that's out. I think we can start with the whole purpose of this project and start working on the turbo. Go down under there and take a look. All right, so now we have complete access to the turbo. I see the exhaust flange is there, easy to get at. Here is the oil return line from the turbo. I've already disconnected it. That just pulls out. This entire piece gets replaced. The first order of business is going to be to remove the control lines. There's 4 of them. 2 of them here on the 2 of them here on the outlet of the turbo there and there. They have these squeeze clips that you squeeze and pull the lines off. Then there's one here, as you can see, going into the wastegate actuator, and there's one right next to it. So that's the 4. The top 2 control lines are easily accessible from above, as you can see by this view of the wastegate actuator. That's a aftermarket wastegate actuator. So while we're here, we'll grab the 2 nuts holding on the top of the heat shield. That's one of them there. It's a 13 millimeter and there's one on the other side. Those two nuts are also two of the four nuts that hold the turbo to the exhaust manifold. The bolt may come out instead of the nut. As you can see, somebody has been here before and that ruined this bolt, so I'm going to get new bolts for any of the bolts that come out. This bolt on the bottom of the heat shield there is a T30 Torx. Well, these coolant lines are stopping the heat shield from coming out, so you probably want to save the heat shield until after taking this side of the coolant lines off. In between those two lines is a 7mm bolt. So I had a problem with this 8mm bolt that's in between these two coolant lines. It's not coming out. So I'm going to disconnect the coolant lines at the other end. One of them you can access from above, and it's just like these hinge clips on these control lines. The other one looks like a banjo going into the block. You see it right there. I've already gotten an Allen on it. It's a 10mm Allen. I can't get at it to break it free, so I'm going to disconnect this exhaust flange, and hopefully I can move this cat away a little bit to get at that coolant line banjo right there. I've got the two bolts off of the exhaust flange here. The top one was easier to get to from above. They're 15mm. This cat is not budging, so we have this mount over here. I'm going to take these two bolts and this nut off and get that bracket off, and maybe the cat will be loose enough so I can get at that coolant line banjo. Alright, I have the bracket off. There, it was attached to there. The one nut and two bolts were 13mm. Now with that bracket off, I was able to move this cat out of the way, and see if we can get a shot of that. And there is the banjo I'm trying to get at. So now I'll be able to get a wrench on it, or a socket on it from above, I believe, and get that loose. I was able to get that banjo loose from above. It was pretty easy with the cat out of the way. And it's a good thing I chose from above, because as you can see, it started leaking coolant as soon as I broke it free. Alright, the coolant line out of the block is disconnected. The other one looks like we can disconnect with a pinch, one of those squeeze hose clamps. So this is the line here. I don't know if you can see, but right here it goes into a rubber hose, and on that is just a pinch hose clamp. So I'm going to get that off. Well, it's the next day, and obviously the turbo assembly is out. After removing the coolant line where we last left off, I went down to remove the heat shield, loosened up these two bolts, the last two holding the turbo on, and the turbo almost fell out. So I had no choice but to finish removing it. The only thing you missed in that removal was obviously those two lower bolts that go to the exhaust manifold, and this oil supply line. It's very accessible. It's right there. Got that bolt out of the assembly, and it pulls right out. This whole thing is replaced as well, the same as the return line. We were able to get the strip bolt out of the coolant lines here, so the coolant lines are free and still in good condition. Next, I need to remove my Turbo Smart wastegate actuator. I've got the two nuts off. There's a C-clip here to take off, and then I'll move that to the new turbo assembly, and we'll move on to the install.